Hey there. I'm going to share with you my experience of picking grapes in my early years. This is going to be kind of like one of those brief but spectacular things that they have on PBS News. So I hope you enjoy this. So I'm told that I personally began picking grapes at the ripe old age of 5 years old. I think we all kind of began about that same age, except maybe for Juanita, because Tita didn't really want her going out at that age. So I'm not really sure what age she started, but it definitely wasn't at 5 years old. You're going to notice that my head is kind of going up and down. I'm going to be reading a little bit about this too. These are my notes. So Mom and Dad told us that they wanted us to go out in the field with them and pick grapes so we could learn the value of the dollar, and also know that we really didn't want to do field work for the rest of our lives. It's really, really hard work. So, and Mom and Dad wanted better for us. Mom and Dad had been farm workers in their youth and in their adult lives, and also they knew how to work in the fields. It took me a little while to realize that when Dad would come out and pick grapes with us, he was actually utilizing one of the weeks of vacation he got at the post office to come out and work with us. So he and Mom, had worked their ways out of the fields, but were still not too proud to take their kids out in the field to go out and work. Now, some of our cousins never really had to go work in the fields, and I think it was because their parents really didn't want them to be seen working out in the fields. A little bit different mentality than our folks, I guess. Mom and Dad were in their 30s and 40s when they took us to the fields to work, and you know that they've always been very hardworking people. And I truly believe that they've instilled that hard work ethic in all their kids. I know that Anita and Juanita are very hard workers, and I'd like to believe that I'm a hard worker too. We never felt ashamed, or I never felt ashamed of doing this work. I didn't really, at that age, I really didn't see it as a learning experience. I was pretty much just this dumb kid that I would do everything that my folks told me to do. But as I look back on my time in the vineyards, I know it was a huge learning experience for me. I believe I'm a better person for it because I know that all people, including farm workers, are good and honorable people. I do remember that Nita would not like having her hands dirty from the grape juice and the dirt that would mix with that and stain her hands. She had to go to school looking that way, and you know that kids are not very forgiving when there's something different about you. So at that time, it was really, really tough for her. Our work crew consisted of our family, Dad, Mom, Juanita, Anita, and myself. Along with us, we brought the San Jose Marquezes. That was Barbara, Phil Jr., Larry, and Ernie. In addition to that, we have our Flores cousins. That was Theorina, Benny, Bobby, Stevie, Susie, and Victor. And lastly but not least, our guitarist cousins, Theotili, Johnny, and Louie. So when we showed up to work, we were a formidable sized crew. One of my first memories of picking grapes was that we were always picking in various fields. Neil Mack, he was I guess you'd call him a grape contractor at that time, and he would find different fields for people to go work in. We were part of that crew that he would find work for. But when we were working in those fields, there were a lot of people out there working, huge amounts of people, and trying to find a row of grapes to pick sometimes could be very, very competitive. There were families who would go out there and actually pick enough grapes to put down one tray at the beginning of a row. They'd write their name on it and save that row for themselves. So we'd have to walk a long ways past all these rows and had a single tray before we could find one that was vacant and we could start picking. So like I said, it was very, very competitive when we were in those fields. So one of the many fields that we picked was actually owned by a gentleman by the name of Sam Watanabe and his wife. I didn't remember her name at the time, but I did learn it later on. So while we were picking what was referred to as their remote vineyard, Dad and Mr. Watanabe got to talking on a regular basis, and they became sort of friends. So at one point, Mr. Watanabe asked Dad if we would want to come work at his home ranch. That way we wouldn't have to compete with all these families for trying to find rows to pick, and it'd be easier on us. So the home vineyard that we went to pick at, of course, Dad said yes. So the home vineyard we went to pick at was located about 15 miles south of town. It was 11 acres of a really well-maintained Thompson seedless grapes. There were no weeds in this whole field, and there were very few wasps. So having no weeds is a really big deal, especially if you're trying to pick grapes with a lot of really tall weeds that are kind of in your way, interfering where you're trying to work. I personally never knew anything about the Watanabes when we worked for them. Like I said, they just seemed like really nice people, very quiet and unassuming. They treated us really well, not just like laborers. We were actually friends of theirs. But many years later, Sharon and I took a vacation around 2017, and we drove down Highway 395 along the east side of the Sierras. And we had an opportunity to visit one of the Japanese internment camps called Manzanar. And when we went into the visitor center, I noticed there was this large cloth drape that they had way in the back. And on that cloth drape, they actually had the names of all the Japanese who had gone through that internment camp. And to my surprise, I found the names of Sam Goro Watanabe and Hayako Watanabe, his wife. These were Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe, the people who we had picked for. What a shock to know that they were there. So what was it like to work in the fields? I'll describe kind of a typical day, how a typical day would go. So we would get woken up very gently at about 5 o'clock in the morning by Mom. Our dirty clothes would be sitting by our beds, and those are the clothes we would wear, I believe, for like 6 days in a row until Mom had an opportunity to wash them on the weekends. And we'd put those clothes on and get ready for the day. Right after that, Mom and Tita would start making breakfast for us, and then they would also make our lunches. So for lunch, we usually had bean and meat burritos wrapped in tinfoil. Man, those were good. I know that we tried replicating what they made for us for lunch over the years, and it just really hasn't turned out the same. And it could be that the whole situation of being out in the field made them taste even better for us. We also would have a bag of chips and a soda for our lunch. So the sodas, they would always put in the freezer at night, and in the morning they would take them out and wrap them in newspaper so that they would slowly defrost from the morning until lunchtime. And right around lunchtime, they would usually be defrosted, and we would have cold sodas for lunch without really having to refrigerate them. We also had, I believe, homemade cookies for dessert. So how did we get out to the fields? Our first transportation to the grape fields was my dad's 1941 black Ford step-side pickup. This is a truck that Dad first taught me how to drive when I was 13 years old. So Dad and Mom and Juanita would sit up front in the cab while the rest of us kids would lay down in the back with blankets over us, because at 6:30 in the morning when we would leave, it was really cold. In 1966, Dad traded in the Ford and bought a brand new green Chevy pickup. For the first few years, we still had to lay down in the truck bed with our blankets until around 1968 when Dad bought a camper shell for the truck. He actually bought the camper shell so we could take a vacation trip up to Montana. The ride that we took to the Watanabe's vineyard always seemed really short. It was located just beyond a little area that what was referred to as Mochizuki. And this was an area that a lot of Asians lived in. They had a lot of farms and ranches out there. So after we got to the Watanabe's house, we would make that walk from the truck out to the vineyard and choose a row of vines that each one would pick. The rows were probably about 1/8 of a mile long, I think, really hard to remember, but I do remember that they seemed really, really long when you were picking them. When we were younger, we would pick in the same row with either mom or dad because we were really too slow to take a row to ourselves. But once we got in our teens, I believe, we would get our own row to pick. So to me, the best part of being able to pick your own row was that you got to write your name at the first tray along the row with the total number of trays in that row. It made me feel pretty proud of picking an entire row by myself. So Dad was always the official watch carrier. It was an old pocket watch that needed to be wound every day. And he would tell us when we would go for lunch, when lunch was over, which was about 20 minutes for him and about a half hour for us. And when it was time to go home, it was around 5 o'clock in the evening. Mr. Watanabe had set up a place for us to eat lunch next to his house under what I remember, was a really large fig tree. We sat on the wooden boxes and used a few boxes with paper trays as our tablecloths. Man, it felt really good to sit on those boxes after a long morning of work. Lunchtime was not only for us to eat, but to talk with our cousins and joke around a little bit. When lunch was over, we made that long, hot walk back to the field and began working again. And of course, Dad was already there working when we got back. So, picking grapes, Thompson seedless grapes, is pretty straightforward, but very hard work. You would use a large, round metal pan, and you would fill it with bunches of grapes that you cut from the vine. Then when the pan was full, it weighed about 25 pounds. And you would lay out a paper tray that was about 2 foot by 3 foot, and you'd lay it on the smooth sloped ground between the rows and dump the grapes bunches on the tray. Then you'd spread the bunches evenly so that they could dry into raisins. So until I was big enough to lift a pan by myself, every time I had a full pan, I would have to yell "tray." Yell it really loud. And then Mom would come over and she would dump our grapes onto the waiting tray. This is a lot of hard work for my mom because she did it for both me and Anita and Juanita when we were younger, and she would also dump the grapes she would pick. A lot of hard work. So we would do this repetitive work from 7 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock in the evening. It was backbreaking work. The mornings were dark and cold, and the afternoons could reach well into the hundreds. In addition, we were always working in vines that had been sprayed with sulfur and pesticides, and we would finish the day covered with dust, pesticides, and grape juice on our clothes, our skin, and in our eyes. Later on, Nita and I would both develop cancer of our reproductive organs. Nita had ovarian cancer, and I had testicular cancer, but glad to say we were both multi-year cancer survivors. Another risk that we dealt with in the vineyards when we were picking were paper wasps. The wasps would sometimes build their nests in the vines, and since we needed to pick all the grapes, we would have to deal with the wasps. But when I say we, I mean Mom. She was the only one brave enough to deal with the wasps. She would take a paper tray and she would roll it up in kind of like a torch, and she would light it. And then she would light it on fire. Then she would push this flaming tray into the nest of the wasps, and while the wasps were disoriented by the flames and the smoke, she would pick the infested vine. I don't know if she was ever stung while she was doing this, but I know I was stung many times by wasps on the arms and face and neck. I never really want to be stung again. The sting is really painful. Like I said, picking grapes is really hard work, and I wasn't a very fast picker, and neither was my dad. But Nita was a dynamo when it came to picking grapes. She could pick over 200 trays per day. I could do about 170 on a good day. One time I remember I had injured my hand in football practice, and I couldn't really hold a knife to be able to pick grapes. So I decided that maybe I could come in and I could help Nita by dumping and spreading the grapes while she picked. So we did that. And at the end of the day, Nita had picked over 300 trays that day. So another person who was really fast was my cousin Barbara. I remember one time Dad said that he and Barbara both started picking in rows next to each other. They started at the beginning. And when Dad looked up, he noticed that Barbara had just left him in the dust. So he figured that, by the only reason that Barbara really was really far ahead was that she probably had not that much grape in her vines that she was picking. And that could be the only explanation for her moving so far ahead of him. So he leaned over and peeked over the vines and looked down her row and saw the same number, if not more, trays on her row as there were in his. So that at that time we all knew that Barbara was really fast. So like I said, someone could probably pick around 200 trays a day if they were good. Each pan weighed, when it was full, weighed about 25 pounds. So if you do your math on that, that means that we would lift around 5,000 pounds of grapes every day we worked. That's 2.5 tons of grapes we would lift every day. Yep, and that was hard backbreaking work. At the end of the day, Dad would let us know when it was 5 o'clock, and we would start our walk back to the truck for the trip home. Sitting in the back of the truck on the way home was a lot better than coming in the morning. The wind would cool us down from the long day and the 100-degree heat. We would eat grapes on the way home, and what we would also try and do is, since we were moving about 30, 40 miles an hour, we would throw individual grapes into the wind as we're sitting in the back of the truck and watch them come back and try and catch them in our mouths. The other thing we would do is that when we would see a grape truck that we would pass along the road, we would do this and hope that the truck driver would honk his horn, and usually they did. So, being a kid about that time was pretty darn cool. So, towards the end of the day, all the kids would be dragging with what we would call exhaustion. But it looked like that when we got home, we got our second wind, and we'd play outside with the cousins from San Jose who were staying with us during all this picking time. We'd run around and we weren't tired anymore, and we'd swim in our little doughboy pool. But for Mom and Dad, the day wasn't over just yet. After they'd showered, Mom would then begin to help Tita to make supper for us all, and Dad would go out and clean all the grape pans. Dad would then either sit outside or in the garage and sharpen all of our grape picking knives that we used. The knives had a wooden handle and a curved blade. The curved blade was used for kind of hooking the stem of the grape bunch, the racimo, and cutting it. After dinner, Mom would help wash the dishes and then finally get to sit in a chair in the living room to relax. But, part of her time in the chair was also for mending gloves, cuts in the gloves that we wore. Dad would then also go outside to clean out our root beer, clean out the water jugs that we used for fresh water in the fields. They were actually 1 gallon glass A&W root beer jugs that Mom would cover with burlap. She would sew burlap around them. And in the morning, what we would do is we would wet the burlap to keep the water cool during the day for us to drink. So I described our fast pickers. We had fast pickers and we had slow pickers. Our slow pickers were the cousins that liked to have a little bit too much fun in the fields while we were there. One time, my cousin Johnny really, really didn't want to work one day, and he decided that he would carve a baby booty out of a dirt clod instead of working. The booty was a work of art, but of course he had wasted an entire morning doing it. But the ones who were just having a lot of fun were Phil Jr. and all the Flores boys. They would have grape fights and chase each other down the rows. Once Junior even ended up falling face first into a tray of grapes. There was grape juice everywhere. So yeah, we had our good times too. I remember one time when I was about 9 years old, I just didn't want to work one morning. So I just sat in the dirt, staring at the grapevine. Mom came by and asked me, "Well, why aren't you picking?" And I told her it was too dark, I couldn't see the grapes. And another time I told her it was too cold, I couldn't pick the grapes. And Nita and Juanita still tease me about this. The best time of all while working in the fields was when we finished picking the Watanabe's entire vineyard. We would take the long walk back over to their home, and Mr. Watanabe and Mrs. Watanabe would always have ice cold 16-ounce RC colas waiting for us as a celebration, as a thank you for us. While we were out there having a great time drinking our sodas and joking around, Mom and Dad would always sit down with Mr. Watanabe and agree on how many trays we had picked in the field, and Mr. Watanabe would then cut the checks for us. So like I said, we picked grapes for 2 weeks each summer, beginning sometime in September, and those 2 weeks seemed a lot longer when you were out there. We were paid by the tray, so the more we picked, the more money we made. When I first started picking, that was around 1960, we were getting paid 3 cents a tray. So if you could pick 200 trays in a day, you made a whopping $6. And that's not much money even for the 1960s. So when I stopped picking grapes and I got a job at my Uncle Eno's hardware store, I was 16 years old. At that time, we were being paid 26 cents a tray. So if you could pick 200 trays a day, you'd make $52 for the day. And for the longest time, I really didn't know where this money that we were making while picking grapes was going. The only thing I knew was Mom and Dad would give me $5 to spend at the Father's Fiesta that the church would put on every September. But later on, I would find out that they actually took this money and purchased our school clothes with it. And I assume they would also, if there was anything left, would help pay for some food and cover some of the bills. So if you'd look at us when we got all dressed up and we went to the fields, we would look like any other Mexican family of farm workers. Mom wore jeans, a long sleeve mailman shirt, a bandana over her hair, and a mailman pith helmet. We all wore long sleeve shirts to keep the sun off of us and to protect our arms from being scratched by the vines. The women would also wear gloves to hopefully help keep their hands a little cleaner. One memory sticks in my mind to this day, and it directly relates to how we looked when we were dressed to work in the fields. One day we were coming home and we were stopped by the police on the way home. And Mom was driving that day since Dad was working at the post office, and all his kids were in the back of the truck in the camper shell. Turns out that the officer just stopped her because we were coming from the fields, and to him we looked like a bunch of Mexicans that were illegals. But once he finally figured out that we weren't illegals, he had to come up with something, so he told my mom that he had pulled her over because she was speeding, and that he could write her a ticket to take her whole day's wages if she didn't slow down. You know, racial profiling is never fun. I never asked my mom how this event made her feel, but I can tell you I hate this memory. We did have a good laugh when we got home, though, because we said, how could he think he could write a ticket for over $200? We really believed that he couldn't do that because we were really, really proud of a full day's work where we made over $200 picking grapes. So picking grapes in 100-degree weather was really hard, but also a great learning experience. And it allowed time with my family and my cousins that I'll never forget. So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.